Wonderful. So today's panel is going to be around eVoting, a more accurate election outcome. And we're fortunate to have a stellar panel here to discuss it. We're going to go through a bit of a background to give an overview in just a second. Then I will invite each of the panelists to do a brief introduction. And then we have 7 questions to cover as a panel, and then we're going to open it up to the rest of you. So do keep your questions coming, and there's a Q&A function where you can register those, and we want to make this as not just interactive, but to go through as many of these questions as we can. Get us started, to give a bit of a background. So my name is Husayn Kassai. I'm one of the 3 co-founders and the CEO at Onfido. I'll be the moderator today. And as a company, Onfido, our focus is around digital identity verification. So anything around e-voting, as you can probably imagine, is something that we watch quite closely and follow. So to give a brief background and context, as far as elections go, most of us know it's far from perfect. There are a few challenges, one being the long queues and the difficulties it is for a growing number of individuals to actually exercise their democratic rights and be able to vote. The second issue is around cybersecurity. This impacts not just how elections are run today. There are perceived risks as well as real ones that hopefully we can discuss a little bit today. And lastly, as we think about e-voting, to just consider what the risks there may be with that and how we may be able to address them. So in essence, this is a bit of an overview on what the US government suggests are some of the risks with election security. And as you can tell, it's a pretty long list. So what I suppose most would agree on is the current state of affairs is not a good one, and that the current election process has quite a few flaws. In order to structure the discussion and have a bit more of a focus, the 2 key areas that hopefully we'll be able to cover in more depth. One is around inclusivity and how are we able to make elections more open for more participants. And the second is around security. What are some of the risks and what could be done about it? On the point around inclusivity, we're lucky that we have Freddie from Okta here with us, and they recently produced this report that suggests 14 million Americans are perhaps more likely to register to vote if it were easier to do so. And this is something that hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about as we go through today's discussion. And with that, to introduce the panel to you, I'm going to invite each one to come on and spend a minute or so telling you more about their role and their background. And as we finish introductions, we'll get into the first question. So with that, Freddie, if I could welcome you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Husayn, and thanks everyone for joining us. I guess good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on where you are. My name is Frederic Kerrest. I'm the Executive Vice Chairman, Chief Operating Officer, one of the 2 co-founders at an enterprise identity management company called Okta. We're very happy to be here today. Okta enables any organization anywhere around the world to connect to any technology. We have 2 parts of the business. The first one is around workforce identity management, but the second one is around customer identity management, and I think that's most relevant for today. We have a lot of customers and consumers, and at companies like FedEx and T-Mobile and federal, state, local government agencies, the Department of Justice, DoD, many others, log into Okta every day to purchase goods and services, manage their personal accounts. So very excited about today's conversation. Thanks for having me.
Terrific. Really, really great to have you on. Next, we'll go on to Leo, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hey, Husayn, sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Not at all. I'm just inviting you to introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Leo, the CEO of, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Okay. I'm Leo, the CEO of a company called Agora. It's a protocol company that builds, it's basically like the EOS of your phones. It builds blockchain infrastructure to enable people to build decentralized apps on top of the infrastructure. The thing is, one of the main products that we built was a voting app on top of the infrastructure. And our goal is to enable people to build many apps on top of the infrastructure that can help. Sorry, Zoom.
It's okay, we're following. We can hear you well. So I'm just going to give Leo the chance to come back, but I hope that was an overview. And if we go on to Jeremy.
Hey, thanks. Hello, everybody, and thanks for the invitation to join today. My name is Jeremy Grant. I'm part of the cybersecurity and privacy practice at Venable, which is a law firm based out of DC, though I'm not a lawyer. There's a longer story there for another day. I also serve as coordinator of an organization called the Better Identity Coalition, which Onfido helped found with about a dozen other companies 2 years ago, looking at some of the policy issues tied to improving digital identity in the US. My background's more than 20 years split between government and industry, working on issues of technology and security, policy, most of it with a focus on digital identity. I spent about 4.5 years at NIST as helping them build out their digital identity research and standards team, in my role leading the national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace. Outside of my work life, I've worked on more than a half dozen campaigns. I've been a precinct captain on election day, led Get Out the Vote efforts. Within our firm, we've put on exercises with voting officials, gaining out what could go wrong with different scenarios on election day, looking at technology and other issues. So a little bit of my background that will help fuel some of what we talk about today. Thank you.
Wonderful, terrific. Really great to have you all on. So we have Freddie from the largest identity company, Leo representing a company that actually runs digital and e-voting. And we've got Jeremy with a wealth of experience around working both on the government side as well as standards and so on. So with that, let's get started with our first questions, and let's just get straight to it. Could elections be run more effectively via e-voting? And perhaps, Jeremy, if we go back and start with you, that would be good.
Sure, thanks. Well, I'd say in theory, sure, but in practice, I think we're unfortunately years off from knowing how to get this right. Look, what we're going through here in 2020, it's not the first year somebody said, hey, why can't we do this online? The reality is there's a lot of smart people who've been looking at this topic for years. National Academies of Science here in the US devoted over 160 pages to this in a really detailed report by people much smarter than me just 2 years ago. And the long and short of it is, their conclusion is election systems are really complex. They're not easily improved by technology, and there's a lot of ways, if we don't think through it carefully, we could actually make things worse. Now, given that a lot of us on this panel have roots in the identity space, you might think we're here today to talk about why it's an identity problem. And it's not, at least not entirely. It's not just an identity problem, although I do think identity is one of the biggest problems to solve from a technology and a security and a practical perspective. Look, from where I'm coming from, I run a group called the Better Identity Coalition. And inherent in that group's name, that we need to make identity better, is the idea that the tools we have in place here in the US aren't good enough. So that's one starting point for the discussion. And I also want to put forward, it's not just a technology problem. The technology is also really important. A lot of these problems go well beyond the technical layer. So technology is not a full solution, but it does give us tools we can use. On the security side, I assume we're going to get more in this, into this today. I think it's safe to say most security experts have got a lot of concerns here. From my perspective, there's reasons to look at this with a little bit of trepidation. The reality is we've never really been good as a world in building truly secure systems. Software is buggy. Even the best encryption tools have vulnerability. We see them uncovered year after year. And the threats, not just teenage hackers, but it's well-resourced nation states like the Russians who've got really amazing technical capabilities and are hard set on using them to disrupt Western democracy by interfering in our elections. So, to be clear, that doesn't mean they have to, take down the whole system. They just have to disrupt things enough to raise questions about the credibility of the results. So there's a lot of challenges here. Now, setting all those issues aside, I think the discussion we should be having today is whether we can do this better, say, 10 years from now, and how. And as much as I don't want to just be chasing technology, I also think it's going to be pretty lame if we can't vote from our smartphones in 2030. As technology is becoming more pervasive in our lives, people are going to expect that services like voting come to them. So, I think for purposes today, we may talk a little bit about this November's election or what happens in a year or two, but I'm really interested in talking about the goal that we're trying to get to and what it might take to change some real challenges that we have today so that this could potentially be possible at some point in the future. Thanks.
Great. Freddie.
Yeah, I think, well, Jeremy had a lot of very good points there, and I appreciate a lot of that. I definitely think that elections could be run much more effectively by e-voting. Look, just the availability of mail-in voting alone allows to make the process easier. You get more citizens that can get involved. It makes it more fair, removes a lot of the burden of physically going somewhere. So going from mail-in voting, which obviously we're dealing with actively in today's environment, to e-voting is something we absolutely have to do. I think the US Census example that just came out and the Census 2020, for those of us in North America and the United States who did that, for me personally, it was an excellent experience. Took under 5 minutes, worked very, very well. And the early results from the Census Bureau are that there was a lot more activity and a lot more households were involved than ever before because of the simplicity of this, number one. Number two, I think we have to think a little bit about when we talk about security, we talk about privacy. Everyone's very comfortable banking today online. I mean, these are our most important financial assets. Everyone does it from their phone. They deposit checks. They transfer money all around the world. In fact, people I barely even use cash anymore at all. So if we're able to do this from a financial perspective on our most trusted assets, I don't see how we're not going to be able to get there from a voting perspective. I know we're going to talk about security and privacy in a lot more detail later on, but I think if you just ask the general population, I know they've done a number of studies in Utah and Minnesota. As an example, 60% of all respondents completed that Census Bureau survey 2020. So it's not just a question of what people want to do, it's what they're actually doing today. Now, I totally agree, Jeremy, there's a lot of risk here. You don't have to look much further in the past than the Iowa caucus debacle. Obviously, these systems have to be properly developed, properly deployed, properly tested. But this is the direction in which the world is going, especially with, unfortunately, what's happened over the last 6 or 8 months with the COVID-19 global pandemic. Everyone is going more digital, and we are not going backwards. If you look at the e-commerce numbers alone, we've gone in North America from 6 to 16% of all commerce was done electronically between 2010 and 2020. And in the first 6 months of this year, we've gone from 16% to 27% of all commerce done electronically. And that's not going backwards. So I think this is something we absolutely have to do. I think 2030 is way too long from now, Jeremy, frankly. I understand it's not going to be this fall. I wish it were. But I think that you already see a lot of both state, local, city, county governments that are shifting a lot of their most critical technology online, whether it's just to recoup taxes or interact with their customers, us as residents, much more effectively. So I'd love to see something happen in the next few years. And frankly, I'd love if by 2024, the election in North America and the United States is something we could do entirely online. And then finally, we will talk a lot about technology, but let's be honest, technology is moving fast, moving forward very, very fast. And when you think about all the biometric tools that are out there today, you think about what's possible even coming into and out of the United States when we are able to travel through airports, I understand. They can do that electronically. They can do that very quickly. So these are things we have to do. These are things we have the capabilities to do. I think the momentum is there, and I'm very excited about what the future portends.
Understood. So as far as Jeremy is concerned, potentially there are questions around it. You're clearly a much more stronger advocate. Leo. If you're on mute.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Perfect, yes.
Yeah, Husayn. Yeah, I'm really sorry. I had problems with my Zoom. So I'm just gonna get back quickly on what Agora is. Agora is basically like the EOS of your phone. The core product of Agora is a consensus mechanism, on top of which you can build many apps. The consensus mechanism is non-financially incentivized. So the idea is to provide consensus to add transactions to the blockchain. There's no need for you to mine or for you to stake tokens. There's no financial incentive. There's no financial behind. And obviously, when we designed that, the idea was a very research-oriented product, and not necessarily something that was meant to be used by the end user, by the citizens. But then step by step, we started thinking how non-financially incentivized consensus mechanism can be used. And the guys in the lab were thinking about privacy coins, but at that time, a lot of people were designing privacy coins, and all of us, are Swiss, and here we vote maybe 3-4 times a year. So the other obvious use case that we had in mind was voting. So the idea for us was to enable ourselves and others to build apps on top of this non-financially incentivized consensus mechanism. So the first app that we built is an app that kind of integrates quite well with you guys, where basically you would manage the identity of the citizens. So like, I don't know if in the UK it's the case, but here in Switzerland, you can open a bank account with your ID from your phone. So you just have to show the reflections of your ID to your ID manager, show your face, and your ID manager will ask you to do a series of movements in a random way to make sure that it's not a recorded video, but actually it's a real video of yourself at that time. And once your ID manager checked your card, checked your face, and matches, just gives us an input, which is yes or no. So we don't necessarily know, we don't know the data, we do not manage data, we let the identity manager deal with that, but us as voting provider, we're not interested in data, and I think it's even in the long term better for our business not to be interested in data. We receive the input from you guys.
Neil, can you hear me okay? So that's really great to hear, and so specific, and seeing the user journey end to end is helpful. So on this question around could elections be run more effectively via e-voting, and while we're on it, I'm going to throw the next question also onto you to help us with the first, and this is around what is the impact of not giving citizens the right to vote by mail or electronically in the upcoming US elections?
The turnover, obviously, like we struggle a lot. I mean, in Europe, and I think it's the same in the US, the young generations are not, really keen into queuing for hours and going to polling stations. So by not giving us the option to vote from distance, I'm just gonna, make the whole process, the whole election less credible, in my opinion. And I really think, as Freddie said it, and as Jeremy said, the technology is moving fast, and there are means for us to make sure that every vote counts, and to make sure that there is security in the process. And as he said, if we can send millions from our phone via e-banking, it's also, I think, very manageable to vote. And if we, for example, did it in DRC or in Sierra Leone, I think we can do it in less challenging environment like the US. I mean, we had two use cases, one in a very strong, big country, like I think 5 times the size of France, no internet connection, not even in the capital city. And we managed to link the voting machines to via internet, and we used Amazon drones as well. In Sierra Leone, we had iPads, and they used internet dongles. And we had like more than 2 million people voting in Sierra Leone. I think over 5 million people voting in DRC. I think it's doable in the US. Obviously, it's just a matter of political willingness, I'd say.
I hear you, and I know that it's hard to talk about a discussion focusing more on the technology and the security and inclusivity bit without the politics. But the politics is relatively well covered, and so I'm glad that so far we're keeping it productive much on this topic, and specifically on the tech security and inclusivity piece. So Freddie, just before I go on to you, as a reminder, please do log your questions, and if you we'll come to them. So Freddie, your views on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so the impact of not giving citizens the right to vote. I mean, both mail and in-person voting methods in the United States have historically had a lot of problems, right? Everything from systemic voter suppression, right, which electronic voting does help address by making voting easier and more fair. The digital divide, right? Many voters do not have dedicated internet at home. So it's understandable there are a lot of concerns about e-voting. And if it was, if it's going to be secure, trusted, and accurate, I know we're already seeing a number of questions about people saying, hey, is this going to work? And we're going to absolutely have to have, hand submitted ballots afterwards by mail as a backup. And yeah, I totally understand. At the same time, we can't afford not to create it. I mean, whether it's COVID-19 or any numbers of reasons that we've historically seen challenges with voter participation, asking citizens right now to put their health in jeopardy to participate in their civic responsibility, that's a big moral conundrum. And I do expect that we're going to see a lack of remote voting options that are going to impact this election. So as of today, I think there's 8 states out of the 50 comprised of 52 million voters still require in-person voting, as of what I saw a few days ago, including New York State, which is 20 million people, the 3rd largest state in the US, and standalone, it's the 10th largest economy in the world. And they do not allow voters to vote by mail. And then, if you say that your main reason is fear of COVID-19, that doesn't work. So we have to figure out ways to have much better impact and turnout to properly represent people in the voting process. I mean, that's the fundamental basis of democracy. So I think technology is well positioned to help, and I'm glad we're talking about this today and keeping it really focused on technology and not on politics. I think it's very unlikely, obviously, that we could implement e-voting for this election cycle. Jeremy, I totally agree. I mean, there's a long way to go. We've seen, unfortunately, the first tries that they made, they have these big impacts, and when it's negative, like what happened in Iowa, that has big repercussions. But 67% of Americans support mail-in voting to prevent the spread of COVID-19, as an example. And Americans have been voting by mail since at least the Civil War. So we've got plenty of experience and we know how to do this. And having multiple options for voting, including broadly available mail-in voting, it makes the process easier, makes it more likely for citizens and much more fair. It removes the burden of having to physically go to a set location. So I think you have to think beyond this 2020 election. I think electronic voting is very important, and I think it's a key way to improve access and increase voter participation, which I think is fundamental to democracy in the United States.
Understood. Jeremy.
Yeah, I think Freddie and I are very well aligned in terms of both being passionate about increasing participation in U.S. democracy, or for that matter, democracies across the globe. And, on this question, look, electronically, it's not an option, so there's not really much to talk about there. By mail, look, if vote by mail is limited in this election, it's going to have the impact of disenfranchising millions of Americans. Between what we're seeing in some states where they're going to be closing or limiting the availability of polling places because of the pandemic, the longer lines that are going to follow, it's increasing the burden that's being imposed on Americans to exercise, the most fundamental and basic constitutional right. And, given the health risk so many people are facing, I'd be fine, from a health perspective, from a risk perspective, if I had to go wait in line, although I am voting by mail here in DC. But if you've got some sort of pre-existing condition that puts you at greater risk from COVID, well, now you're forcing people to make really hard choices you shouldn't have to do. So look, I'm a huge fan of vote by mail. I might keep talking about that a lot during this, in that it's something we've got today. As Freddie pointed out, we've had it in place for years. It's been, both a very easy and secure way to conduct elections, as well as a great way to increase participation in democracy. Oregon's been a great example here. They were, if not the first state, I know one of the first states to pioneer vote by mail systems. Their whole election's been done by mail for years. And one of the great things that comes out of it is the participation rates are a lot higher than the rest of the country. The 2018 election, 63% of registered voters participated versus 40% in the rest of the country. So I think it shows when you come up with other channels for people to cast a vote, that can bring hundreds of thousands of new people just in one state into democracy. And, on a nationwide basis, there's great potential. So, some of the disputes we're seeing right now, or the discussions around vote by mail, are, to me, really disheartening to see, and that is something we've got today that's proven that can make things a lot easier for people.
Understood. And so that's a good segue onto the next question, which is in some ways related, but switching gears a bit more specific on registering to vote. And naturally, Freddie, given you're from Okta, I'm going to come to you first. And the question is registering to vote just to complicate it?
Yeah, I mean, our voting systems are extremely complex, right? And just about everyone in the world has seen the way that technology can simplify and secure processes that would otherwise be complicated and burdensome. I mean, we've already talked about banking. and our friend Leo is giving us specific examples that are happening in the rest of the world. We did put out a report called the Cost of Privacy Report, as you mentioned earlier this year. And we did, using a third party, we went out and polled tens of thousands of folks on a number of important matters around this. Turns out 14% of Americans who are not registered to vote, they report avoiding registering because of complications with the registration process. So 14% might sound small, but if 14% of unregistered Americans didn't encounter complications, it could translate to 14 million more votes. And that's a sizable number that could impact the outcome of an election. So if you look at a lot of the other third-party analysis that's been done, one study, I think the Brennan Institute said that only 35 out of 50 states, or 36 out of 50 states allow for electronic registration during government offices like the DMV, and only 38 states allow for online voter registration. I mean, these types of policies makes the voter registration process way more complicated than it needs to be, and it leads to 1 in 4 Americans being unregistered to vote.
Absolutely. And so given that this report was in part an inspiration to set up this panel, do you want to just give it some instructions around those who want to read more about it, how they can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. We can certainly publish a number of links about it. It's available off our website, okta.com. And it's something that I think is very important because we went out and talked to folks, not just about voting, but about privacy and security concerns in particular, and about how as people move more and more of their world into a digital world, some of the things that all third parties, whether they're private industry or public public organizations like governments, need to think about to really make people comfortable with behaving online in ways that I think have huge upside. I mean, the democratic capabilities of what's possible now with everyone walking around with a mobile phone and the connectivity that's available, especially in places like Leo mentioned, some of the countries in which Leo's organization works. I mean, this is phenomenal and really moves the dial forward, in particular for young groups, right? For folks who are under 20, under 30, who want to participate in the process of government, this is a huge thing that we have to do to really not disenfranchise, to your point, Jeremy, enfranchise everyone to participate in their local government.
Hear you. And Jeremy.
Yeah, I think I'm in pretty strong agreement here with Freddie. I mean, certainly on the registration side, it shouldn't be complicated. And we've been making some steps in some states to make it much easier. I mean, look, it was back in 1993, Congress passed the motor voter law to allow you actually require that everybody would have the option when they're at the DMV for their driver's license to sign up to register to vote at the same time. Some states make things really easy. Others make things really hard. And, the reality is there's some politics behind that in terms of depending on who's in charge in certain states and, in some cases who they might want to vote or not, they do put up barriers to voting. We've been dealing with this for, basically since the end of the Civil War, if not longer in the US. And so a lot of this continues today. I think registration is a much easier topic to solve than voting itself, just because I think the security risk involved with somebody signing up to register to vote is really different than when you start talking about something more complicated like electronically recording ballot results, which just becomes a much more complex issue. So I think to the extent, and I really like the way Okta tackled this in the report. How can we leverage things like better identity tools just to make it easier to get signed up to vote? And to the extent that we can, start focusing, how would I say it, short of, actual, doing online balloting on election day, if we can look for other ways to leverage technology to increase participation in democracy, I think that's a very good thing.
Great. And just as we're waiting for Leo to dial back in, I'm going to go on to the next question, and I'm going to come back to you, Freddie. How does electronic voting work? Would it dovetail with disparate voting systems already deployed?
Yeah, I mean, I think eVoting could easily dovetail with existing mail-in or in-person voting methods and provide a much fairer and easier process. I mean, if we, Jeremy, to Jeremy's point about authentication, if we authenticate voters' identities, right, when they vote by any method, we'll be able to ensure that every voter is voting one time and only for themselves and prevent voter fraud. I know there's a lot of questions that are coming through on the chat, and I'm sure that we'll get to them in a minute about backup, about fraud, about people's concerns, and they're all well stated, and I understand those, but these are tractable problems. They have to be solved, and we have to go solve them. An e-voting system would need to integrate with a network of trusted identity providers, obviously. It would require creation of a uniform ID proofing standard that would prevent tampering of identity in transit. probably a legal policy framework for identity verification, who can verify your identity, what information is revealed in the verification steps. With this, we can verify that people are who they say they are in a remote setting using biometrics and AI. I think Leo's example of what happens in Switzerland to open a bank account was a very good one. Or Onfido, frankly, right? You're already doing this with many large banks to onboard new users, preventing account fraud, money laundering, and applying this technology. E-voting is the next logical step. So I think it would be critical to easily enable accurate registration, to Jeremy's point, and access to these systems. But I think this issue is holding people back from registering to vote today. And we have to ensure that there is no access issues on election day, as we saw again in Iowa, and that there's a backup system in place for any issues that do occur, which I think was unfortunately took way too long in Iowa and kind of scared everyone away. I think it was over a week so they could figure out what happened. Finally, we need to have technology in place to secure the results of the vote, right? And this is where identity solutions come into play. Obviously, this is something that we care a lot about. I care a lot about personally, and we are paying a lot of attention to at Okta. We already work with a number of states, countries, counties, cities by providing secure access for authentication. Just a couple examples, the state of Illinois is leveraging Okta right now for not only all of its workers, obviously, as they've gone remote, but for people to start to authenticate into all their local systems. Oakland County, one of the largest counties in the US with 1.2 million citizens, had to transition everyone to go remote. We've been working with Maricopa County for a long time, which is where Phoenix is. The city of Las Vegas has implemented Okta to provide faster, secure access to and security for citizens. So these are things that are in play today in very large states and counties, and it's something that we have to put in place at the federal level. And I think the opportunities are there for us to do it, so I'm very excited about it.
That's good to hear. Jeremy, do you have anything to add here before we switch gears and talk a bit about security? Because I know naturally that's a key part of the discussion.
Yeah. Well, I did want to talk about, some of the things Freddie mentioned with identity, and that I think one of the things that makes this so tricky is you don't actually need to have an ID to vote in the US today. The right to vote is enshrined in the Constitution. There is no requirement to have an ID card or a digital identity, nor is there any law that requires you, or even for that matter, entitles you to have one. And while most people do, there's a significant part of the population that can't get an ID card easily, doesn't have one. 5 out of 6 adults have a driver's license. That means 1 out of 6 don't. Less than half of Americans have passports. And it's not like there's a national ID that's out there that's available to everyone. Now, knowing this is an international audience, some folks outside the US are surprised to hear this. They say, how do you run elections without ID? But it's worth noting there's been very few cases of documented voter fraud despite all this. You still have to register to vote. You show up at your designated polling place, so you go through mail in advance. So there's no real scalable attacks that are there in terms of how you could commit fraud. Now, we do have some states that have tried to put voter ID requirements in place. Most of them bluntly are driven by one party looking to make it harder for people who can't easily get an ID to vote. So, I think it's just worth touching on this for a moment as we talk about identity as an enabler, to also point out that, this presents some real challenges when it comes to setting up an e-voting system, given what we have in the identity ecosystem in the US today. And I mean, look, it's a real challenge, when you look at this, on one hand, how do you create a system that can enforce one person, one vote, while on the other hand, not put new requirements in place for a voter ID that might be used to disenfranchise a large part of the population. And I just think that that's one of the areas where we don't have what we need in place yet today to fully solve this.
Great. Now on to security, and Leo, I'm going to bring you in on this. How do we bridge the gap between e-voting? Let me go back to that. How do we bridge the gap between e-voting advocates and the cybersecurity community? And as far as I've seen, it seems as though the cybersecurity community, in a crude way, you could split it as those who are forcefully against this and those who are more open to a conversation and thinking through what the options may be. And maybe it's the right time for a reset. But I'll put that to you, Leo. Where do you stand on this? You may be on mute.
First of all, when we talk about e-voting, e-voting can mean voting from your phone. E-voting can mean linking your voting machines or your printers to a decentralized system of servers. E-voting can mean printing QR codes on your paper ballots. and then scanning them with the software. So eVoting can mean a lot of things, and depending on what software, what application we want to build on top of the infrastructure, there are different, laws in place, and there are different levels of cybersecurity also that are in place. But the idea with, the common ground and the idea with all these applications, at least for us, is to open up that black box as much as possible. And the idea is also to enable the governments, white hackers, and also the community to maybe have access to the code prior to the election, while we're setting up things, so they can audit the systems and kind of also have their feedback to say. I really think that inclusion in this matter could really help a lot eVoting, because I would say the last two decades, the idea was to build, these voting machines. The more private they were, the better it was for their providers, and it was very difficult for the international community or for cybersecurity experts or competitors to have a look at what's actually happening in there. So we really had to trust, that link between the technical provider and the government, and they would come out with a press release after the election saying that everything happened. And I think this is quite not traumatizing, but it's something that we don't want to have to rely on. So I really think that including the cybersecurity community and having them have access to what we're designing prior to the election could, maybe we can have a small use case in one state or one municipality, like we did here in Switzerland in Zug. Before doing it, we, gave access to the code, and we even organized hackathons around the election. And at the end of the day, everything happened and everything went well. Yes. And we received really, really positive feedback, actually.
Great, very, very collaborative approach. So, Jeremy, what do you stand on this?
Yeah, I think the two sides are going to need to partner. I shouldn't even say it's two sides. I think everybody's looking for the same thing. There's some history here over the last 20 years where at least, a good chunk of what I would call the cybersecurity community has become very frustrated with technology providers in this space. And it goes long before the topic of something like smartphone voting. When you look in the US at some of the new types of voting systems that were introduced in the wake of the 2000 election, where, for those of you old enough to remember, we had the issues of what was called hanging Chad in Florida, where, you'd look up at a ballot that had been punched and maybe there was a little hanging piece of paper off of it. And people said, why don't we go digital? And what we saw was the emergence of some new voting machine providers who were doing things digital, who claimed that they were doing great security and frankly didn't pay a lick of attention to it. And, we're still in this phase today where, for the most part, those vendors have taken a very contentious approach with the security community that I think has a lot of people on guard. So I think certainly as we're talking about new ideas or new products, what we don't need are, people coming in on the technology side and throwing it out here and saying, here it is, it's marvelous, it's very secure, come at me, bro. And then, in some cases we've seen, then attacking the security researchers who are finding real vulnerabilities that can create risk. Security experts aren't adversaries, they should be embraced as partners. So I'd like to see a more constructive discussion emerge, around the concept I laid out earlier, which is, look, whether it's 2030, which is what I think is realistic, Freddie said 2024, whatever it is, if we can't do it today, if we can at least lay out this as something that we ought to be able to start, let's make a list of all of the very real concerns that are out there today and start to think about, constructive ways to address them. That's at least a way to start to make progress on this. I think as long as the two sides are in an adversarial role with each other, we're not going to get anywhere. And look, I'll say the community, there is not a monolithic security community. So you do have some folks who are very outspoken on the topic, and there are others who I think are, looking to engage. And so, looking for ways to have better dialogue, change the conversation relative to what I've seen to date, which has been less than ideal.
Understood. So we have two questions before we are going to open up to everyone. And Leo, I'll go to you first, and then Freddie will come back to you. Leo, so what can we learn from other countries that have carried out eVoting? You've already mentioned two examples. If you want to share some more.
Is it my turn?
Please.
Husayn, I can't hear you. Is it?
Correct. If you wanted to share what you think we can learn from other countries that have carried out eVoting.
I'm really sorry if I cut anyone, but I think it's.
Not to worry. It's okay. We can go on to Freddie if you want to share.
Why not? I'm happy to jump in. First of all, very quickly on the last point, again, I get to violently agree with my friend Jeremy. I think we do need experts from both groups who are going to get together and discuss a lot of these things. I agree that in the past that they haven't always been aligned, but I think there's a lot of very good examples. And there's some very smart people who are focused on this. And I think a good example is I have a very good friend from high school actually named Benedita, who went to MIT, got his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in crypto and information security, and today runs VotingWorks, a nonprofit that's focused on building secure and affordable voting machines. So I think there's a lot of very smart people who are focused and working on this, and I think there's a lot of opportunity. So I'm very excited about it. I think there's a lot we can learn from other countries that have carried out e-voting. There's many countries have implemented e-voting already, big ones: Australia, Canada, Estonia, Finland, France, India, Norway. And so it's not like this is brand new and that America is like somehow going to be on the cutting edge. In fact, we're like way behind and we need to get it together. So there's a bunch of, the good news is too, there's a bunch of lessons they've already learned and that we can take advantage of. The first one is you have to design systems, I think, with privacy first, right? In Australia, I mean, you talked about it, Jeremy. First of all, we don't have national ID cards. So we're going to have to figure out a way to do that in a way where there is privacy that is maintained. I think Australia is a very good example. I think their ID numbers were used and then meant to anonymize voters. It failed to properly separate ID numbers from votes and voters, and ultimately it infringed on many Australians' rights to anonymously vote. So there were some problems there. I think voting systems clearly need to leverage privacy by design principles across all facets of development to protect citizens' privacy. Then I think you also have to take, to Jeremy's point, and frankly, what we do a lot as a security company at Okta and with a lot of our security peer companies, helping organizations, both private and public, you have to take an aggressive, offensive approach to security. You can't like sit there and wait for it to happen to you. You have to be prepared to fight off hackers. You have to have an identity solution in place that blocks attempts. I think in Canada, there's a primary election 2012, if I'm not mistaken. Again, for those of us who are a little bit older, disrupted by hackers, led them to hold off implementing e-voting altogether. I think France, where I'm actually half French, so I do have a French passport and I do vote remotely in France as well. They conducted an online primary in 2014 using a system that they touted as secure, proved that it was actually not as secure as they thought. There were some breach allegations. There were all sorts of problems there. So you do have to make the e-voting platform available for security researchers to test, and not just test the week before you put it out. You got to do it months and years before, which is why, Jeremy, I'm still sticking to 2024. I still have hope. I think we have time. We have to get on it, though. We can't wait till spring of 24 to figure it out. And I think if you look at Australia, the election platform was not available before the election. And then security researchers discovered many flaws. And the same thing happened in Ireland going back like 15 years. So again, there are a number of lessons we can learn. Many people are doing this. It is our time, and we have to get our act together.
Perfect. And so, Jeremy, on to this last question. What would need to change in order to persuade more governments to consider e-voting in future elections?
Well, I think at least in the U.S., look, first I'll say, and this is, somewhat of a sad commentary on U.S. politics, but if this was being pitched as a way to increase voter participation, it'd be assailed by any politician who thinks that their path to getting or retaining power is going to depend on having less people vote. I mean, that's just the real politic of what we're dealing with here in 2020. Assuming you can overcome that, I think a lot of it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is, to be taken seriously, any innovation in voting is going to have to address some fundamental concerns about the ability of a foreign adversary, or domestic for that matter, to find some way to exploit those innovations to undermine the credibility of election results. I mentioned the report from the National Academies earlier. Their key recommendations were all around the ways to harden our election infrastructure, safeguard its integrity and credibility. And I think persuading governments or anybody else about the credibility of these new systems is going to be, a lot of it's going to have to focus on how a new innovation is going to do just that, rather than increase the attack surface. And I do think that has been, the biggest issue is, gosh, paper and mail might have their problems, and a lot of what we have today sucks, but it's a controllable attack surface. And if you now are creating a channel online to be electronically recording votes, that just opens up a whole other set of issues, that need to be addressed. And so I do think it's going to need to take a lot of, constructive thinking and engagement before we can really consider it seriously.
Understood. And so I know that we've got a series of people waiting to have their questions answered.
Before we get into the questions, can I say one last thing? I think the best thing everyone can do is vote. We need to elect an administration, at least in the United States, that will consider making positive changes to the current processes. So without getting too political, it's what Americans demand. 67% of Americans support mail-in voting. 18% say online voting would be even better. More than half of Americans worry that e-voting is insecure. So we definitely have to get it right. But again, I point to 2020, the 2020 census was done very, very well. It was a great experience, and everyone is using it. So we can definitely get to the questions, but the number one thing everyone can do is please go and vote.
Exactly. Right. So with that, I'm going to open up to others, and I've got a whole host of questions here we're going to try and get through in the 15 or so minutes that we have left. The first is around, are the USPS changes something that will affect how vendors and government security teams go about preparing for election security threats? And I can open it to the panel, whoever has some thoughts on this.
Sorry, I'm just pulling up the question.
I'm chewing that. So the changes at the Postal Service. Honestly, I don't think so. I think this is going to be more of a political battle over the next 3 months until the election in terms of some of what's going on with the Postal Service. Look, you've got, I think, as of today, 21 states suing the Postal Service right now over concerns that changes they're making might impact the ability to get a fully accurate account. I don't think it's going to, impact vendors so much. I think this is, something we're dealing with. Let's say first, let's get from August to November and see how all of that plays out. And then I think there's a conversation to be had afterwards about, what's the state of the Postal Service and where do we go from here?
Right. So next question. How do various e-voting proposals address the need for recounts? As a voter since 1982, my top concern is hacking and the ability to conduct an accurate recount when needed. Verifying identity of voters is very different than counting their votes. I will never trust e-voting systems that do not have a hand-marked paper ballot for recount purposes. So, as you can see, this is you can think of it as a challenge to what was been said. So what is your response to this?
Look, I'm totally open to the fact that people have been doing, when you do something for a long time, whether it's an individual or a group or a country, it takes a while to get out of that mode and get into a different mode. These pathways are very well built, muscles are built in this way. And so you have to get used to the fact that change is difficult. No one likes change, okay? So I'm all for doing, hand-marked paper ballots for recount purposes? Absolutely, no problem. Mail-in support voting can happen for decades and decades, but that is not an excuse for not moving technology into the realm of e-voting and ensuring that we can make voting accessible to the entire population who wants to vote and should vote, because that's what the democratic principle is based on. So I'm all for any sort of backup support that we need. It can be paper, and it can be paper for a long time, and that's okay. But we have to move forward.
Exactly. On to the next one. USPS recently submitted a patent for blockchain-based online voting. Do you think this is a start of a play to genuinely offer digital remote voting for US elections? And naturally, as Agora is a blockchain-based e-voting system, Leo, do you want to lead on this? Floor is yours. You may be on mute. Yeah, can you hear me, Leo?
I'm happy to jump in. I think that I'm not aware of the specific patent for blockchain-based online voting that was submitted, but I think it's a great idea. And I think that there are states, again, I would point, I think it's Ohio or Illinois is already a state that allows a whole bunch of registration and activity by citizens using blockchain technology. I think Canada has done a whole bunch of identity stuff using blockchain. I think a number of the Nordic countries, if it's Finland or Norway, I can't remember, have also leveraged blockchain. So I think there's a ton of availability and opportunity there. At the same time, I do think blockchain is not only, cutting edge technology, it's pretty much bleeding edge technology. Very hard for people. Talk about forgetting your password or something like that. Not available. It's not coming back. So, the immutability of blockchain has all sorts of upside, but I think there's also a lot of risk there. Jeremy, you probably know a lot about this too.
Well, I just wanted the Postal Service patent. I was actually looking at earlier today when a friend, actually at Onfido, who was not Husayn, flagged it for me. And it's interesting. What they patented was a way to deliver a QR code securely to your door that you could scan hypothetically in some blockchain device or other eVoting system that might be stood up in the future. And so as you talk about, we talked before about the identity challenge, how would you make sure that the right person's casting the ballot and then it's only one person, one vote? What they had patented was a way to, it was basically, they patented sending a QR code, through the mail to your door. That would then be the start of the system. And I don't want to purport to know much more about what they're thinking than that, but if anything, it might have just been looking to protect what they're doing from having somebody else look to patent it as, part of a building block for something going forward.
To hear. And so the next question is, do you think that there's a role for big tech players such as Facebook, Amazon, Google to drive the acceleration towards eVoting? And maybe Jeremy, we could go back and start with you on this one.
I mean, sure, as much as anybody. I think, to me, this is, still when I look at the attack surface and the risks from, nation states who would be doing everything they could to take advantage of a big juicy target like the US, having something that's maybe not so secure. I think you're going to need, smart people from, all corners. And, I think if big tech plays a role, obviously I don't necessarily want to, have, one of those companies controlling the platform. But they can certainly contribute. And, one other point I just wanted to make as we're talking about, big tech and smart people, a lot of the security experts, who are out there calling for, I think we had a questioner, about 3 questions ago who said, I don't trust anything that's not a hand-marked paper ballot. The people who are out there calling for this aren't Luddites. In fact, a lot of them are, PhDs in computer science who have been involved in some of the greatest innovations over the last, 30 or 40 years. And one reason I take what they say so seriously is because they've got a record of innovating, because they've got a record of driving advancements in security. And so when they look at something and say, this scares the crap out of us, I think it's good to take the time to internalize, what they're saying and understand why. Again, I try to be an optimist and I try to look for, where there's a path forward, but don't ignore them or somehow suggest that they're trying to stop progress, because they've been there and done that in other cases before.
No, that's a good point. And it goes back to the community having to be brought along on the journey and essentially a healthy mix of skepticism so that we can distill between what is around the tech-driven challenges versus what maybe political challenges. Freddie, anything to add before we go on to the next question?
No, I mean, I think Jeremy touched on all the important points. I think there's a lot of smart people. They work at all sorts of places. We need to put as much good thought behind this as we can. I agree with him also that I don't know that you want those people controlling the election for all sorts of other reasons that obviously we don't need to get into. But I think the more help, the better. And, this should be a team effort. These things should all be open sourced anyway. People should be able to look at the code. We need more and more people to look at it so that, again, we can be aggressive about cybersecurity. We can be aggressive about privacy. We can put these things front and center. And you need smart people to be able to do that. And I think that we have shown time and time again that there are very good ways of doing this as a group. And what I mean by that is you see when people work together, there's a lot of good things they can do. There's a lot of examples I think that we can lean on here. I mean, this is not, again, we're not starting something from scratch and we're not inventing brand new things that have never happened before. Something I would point to is like, there's a good example right now, the CTI lead, right? Which is first global volunteer emergency response community. It's a right now for COVID-19. It's basically a cyber version of the Justice League. And one of our employees, Mark Rogers, who's our executive director of cybersecurity, he joined, and they're focused on defending and neutralizing cybersecurity threats related to the current COVID-19 pandemic. Now, he's not doing that because he's an employee at Okta. He's doing that because he's a cybersecurity expert, and he's doing that with many other folks who are on those groups. Frankly, plenty of our competitors, and that's not a problem. Like, that is what we have to do to move society forward, and we have to put, you know, whatever our day jobs are and whatever our day preferences are aside for the better good. So I think it has to happen.
I hear you. And that's part of the beauty in the history of technologists, at least to some extent, and just whether it's academic scientists or a whole community, we challenge each other and like what was improving. And that's why it's even more important to distill between, is there a political agenda here or not, so that we can focus on essentially collectively growing, as you're saying. So we have many more questions, but I think I'm hopeful we can get to this one more, and that is, do you think the campaigns in state, local, federal governments are better prepared this time around for hacking attempts? And are they doing a better job protecting accounts and credentials, for example? It's not directly related, but you can see the relevance, if either of you wants to comment.
Yeah, I mean, I like the question because it's pretty loose. Is it better? Better than when? Better than before? Absolutely. It's getting, sorry.
Hacking that, or hacking that happened in the last election cycle in the States.
I understand. I mean, first of all, I think proof's in the pudding. So we'll see what the answer is. I think that everyone is a lot more focused on this. I think you've seen a lot more effort, energy, priority put to this. I think there's a much more productive dialogue going on in most parts of society about this. And I'm certainly hopeful about it. I mean, do I have all the answers? No, I don't. Probably Jeremy actually probably knows more about this specifically, but certainly I hope so.
Yeah, well, I think, as Freddie said, we'll learn a lot more in a couple months when we see what actually happens. But I will say I've been encouraged that there has been a big effort both from the national parties to do something novel like bringing in a CISO and the campaigns as well, and also great work being done at CISA within the Department of Homeland Security to really focus on election security. If you talk to Chris Krebs, who's the director over there, this is a top priority right now, and they've invested quite a bit in working with the states and talking about how to help them harden their election infrastructure, which in many cases had no cyber security protections at all. The campaigns are largely locking down their email accounts with things like FIDO security keys, so that you don't have a repeat of what happened 4 years ago and have somebody's campaign chairman have their Gmail account phished and spread, the contents of it spread all across the news, in a very selective and unflattering way. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, you can come after these campaigns and election infrastructure itself. And so, no, I think there's been a real concerted effort since 2016. Is it enough? We'll find out in November.
Terrific. Thank you. And I know that we're just about to finish on time, and it's a shame. There's so much more to talk about, including the role that foreign interference can play, not just in elections and e-voting issues, but more potentially influence in social media and other sort of the decision-making processes to who to vote for, and whether identity could play a role in that or not. So given that we have less than a minute left, I just want to take the moment to thank every one of you, for not just the panelists, for joining and sharing your views. And it was a really great mix of discussing e-voting, security, registration, and considerations around that. And for all of you listening in, and if you are registered, then vote. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.